European nations were on the rise. Europe had gone from only holding influence within its own countries to becoming a dominant force throughout the world. The discovery of the New World brought many opportunities to great European nations. Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands had started to conquer land and began the creation of their own colonies. These nations soon realized the value in the raw materials, such as the silver in the Potosi mines of Spanish territory. Trade became an important factor in a nation's wealth. The more trade access and ports, the better off a country was. The idea of mercantilism was what really stirred the development of expansive trading networks. The European nations began utilizing their colonies as a basis for a successful global economy that relied on the exchange of materials through trade.
Mercantilism is the belief that a government with heavily regulated trade and commerce will create great wealth for their economy. A country's greatness was based on the wealth they accumulated. The greatest country would have the most bullion. During the 18th century, three great powers, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, centered around the mercantilist idea. They spread their empires out mainly for the purpose of fostering trade and commerce. They believed the only way to increase power was at the expense of another nation. This want for gain created intense rivalry among nations for an upper hand. The only way to grow was by taking others' land. This stimulated wars throughout Europe, India, West Africa, and the Americas. The network of trade did not remain even either. The colonies were not just sending back raw materials, but beginning to manufacture as well. This happened between Britain and its North American colonies, causing it to put in place legislation to restrict their manufacturing. The colonies were meant wholly for their plantation economies. Their main purpose for colonies was profit, not settlement. Spain owned most of South America, while Britain held land in North America, the Caribbean, and India. France had territories in North America, the West Indies, West Africa, and India. The Dutch held lands in the same areas as well.
Plantation economies were developed due to the slave trade. This was a form of slave labor, and the cash crops grown on these plantations were used to trade with other nations. Cash crops served mainly to bring in income for a country. Colonies would work hard to harvest these crops, and they were processed to make other foods and materials. This work was particularly brutal for African American slaves and Native Americans due to harsh working conditions. The most common cash crops were tobacco, indigo, cotton, coffee, and most importantly, sugar. Cash crops grown were processed and made into other goods for trade with other nations.
Sugar was not originally native to the Americas. The perfect climate for their growth is what made them a huge crop. Britain and France's rivalry was only escalated in the West Indies by this prosperous crop. It allowed the Europeans to dominate the sugar trade, which was in a large demand in Europe. It had started to become a part of Europeans' daily life. This staple seemed endless in its uses, bringing great wealth to plantation owners. It coincided with the import of tea and coffee that it would often be added to. The cultivation of this crop was an arduous one. It required back-breaking work that a worker would not willingly agree to. That is why the import of slaves grew so rapidly. The use of practically free labor only brought more wealth to the landowners. This demand for slaves was continually supplied by the transatlantic slave trade.
India has always been seen as a profitable piece of land. Its spices and other goods had caused many nations to seek trade with it. It was also a potential gateway to trade with an even larger entity of China. France and Britain's rivalry continued in the East. They both had charter companies that had a monopoly of trade. The English trade company was the East India Company. India was suffering from the fall of the Mughal Empire. This lack of enforcement allowed the East India Company and the French Company to take over local governments and rule. Often they had their own armies. Further east in what is Indonesia, the Dutch were the predominant traders. The Netherlands had extensive trade all around the globe, connecting many economies.
The transatlantic slave trade was a network between Europe, the Americas, and mostly West Africa to import slaves. This large network perpetuated due to the basis of slave work plantations in the Americas. Slaves embarked on the Middle Passage to the Americas to work on plantations. The slaves were what the global economy began to be built on. They did the harsh labor the landowners would never dare to attempt. They were the laborers in the foundation of the mother country's economic wealth because without them there would not have been the establishment of the global consumer economy.
The successful European nations were evidently because of each country's colonies. The plantations set the scene for the mother country to start developing their economy. As the slaves worked many hours to cultivate and grow the cash crops, enduring harsh treatment and terrible conditions, the Europeans were profiting from it. The colonies produced the goods, and these foods were then processed and sent to the mother country to sell, such as sugar, as well as trade with others in exchange for new goods, such as silk and tea from the Chinese. The exchange of goods with other countries proved to be a valuable asset in making a prosperous global economy, but came at the expense of the people of Africa, Asia, and the New World.